A black boy slept in an abandoned house every night, hiding away from a world he thought had left him behind. But when a cop discovers his secret, he can't stop crying. What was this boy hiding, and why did he choose to sleep alone in the shadows every night? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Sarah Bennett's shoulders ached as she guided her worn sedan into the driveway. The streetlights cast long shadows across her quiet suburban street, and the clock on her dashboard blinked 8:45 p.m. Another late night at the accounting firm meant another rushed dinner with Emma. As she gathered her purse and a stack of files from the passenger seat, something caught her eye. There, in the second-floor window of the old Wilson house next door, a dark shape moved across the glass. Sarah froze, her hand clutching her belongings. The figure seemed to linger for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. "That can't be right," she whispered to herself, squinting through her car window. The house had been empty for at least 3 years, its paint peeling and grass growing wild. The mysterious owner never showed up, and the property had become an eyesore in their otherwise well-kept neighborhood. Sarah's heart thumped against her ribs as she double-checked all her car doors were locked. "You're just tired," she told herself, but her hands trembled slightly as she fumbled with her keys. "It's probably just shadows from the tree branches." "Mom!" Emma's voice rang out from their front porch. "What's taking so long?" Sarah jumped, then let out a nervous laugh. Her 10-year-old daughter stood in the doorway, her brown ponytail swinging as she bounced impatiently. "Coming, sweetie?" Sarah called back, hurrying up the walkway. She couldn't help glancing once more at the abandoned house, but the window was now completely dark. Inside their cozy home, Sarah and Emma sat at their small kitchen table, sharing microwaved leftovers. While Emma chatted about her day at school, Sarah found her thoughts drifting back to what she'd seen, or thought she'd seen. "Mom, are you listening?" Emma asked, waving her fork. "Sorry, honey, I'm just tired," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "Tell me more about your science project." Later that night, Sarah took extra care checking the locks on all the doors and windows. She peeked into Emma's room, where her daughter slept peacefully surrounded by stuffed animals. Back in her own bedroom, Sarah settled under her covers and took a deep breath. It was nothing, she assured herself, attributing the whole incident to her exhausted mind playing tricks on her. Next evening, when Sarah sat at her desk in the home office finishing up some spreadsheets she'd brought home from work, the digital clock on her laptop showed 9:30 p.m., and she decided it was time to call it a night. As she stood up to stretch, her eyes drifted toward the window. The abandoned house next door loomed in the darkness, its empty windows like hollow eyes staring back at her. The memory of last night's shadowy figure made her shiver slightly. "Stop being silly," she muttered to herself, but she couldn't help moving closer to the window for a better look. Sarah was about to turn away when a sound caught her attention. At first, it was so faint she thought she might have imagined it. Then she heard it again, the unmistakable creak of floorboards, followed by what sounded like shuffling footsteps. Her breath caught in her throat as she stood perfectly still, straining to listen. The sounds continued, muffled but distinct. Someone was definitely moving around inside the empty house. Sarah's hands grew clammy as she backed away from the window. These weren't the usual settling noises of an old house. They were human movements, deliberate and steady. Her mind raced with possibilities. Maybe squatters had moved in, or worse, burglars using the empty house as a base. The shuffling sounds grew louder, and Sarah's heart pounded faster. She grabbed her phone from the desk, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed the police department's non-emergency number. "Hello," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'd like to report some suspicious activity at the abandoned house next door to mine." She gave her address and explained about the shadow she'd seen the previous night and the current noises. "I know it might be nothing," she added, "but I'm alone tonight and something doesn't feel right." The dispatcher's calm voice helped ease her anxiety. "We'll send an officer to check it out right away, ma'am. Please stay inside and keep your doors locked until they arrive." After hanging up, Sarah moved to her living room window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see outside. The abandoned house stood silent and dark, but now she knew it wasn't as empty as it appeared. She second-guessed herself for a moment. What if she was overreacting? What if it was just some harmless explanation she hadn't thought of? But then she heard another distinct thump from next door, and her doubt vanished. She had done the right thing by calling. The welcome sight of police car headlights turning onto her street filled her with relief. As the patrol car pulled up quietly in front of the abandoned house, Sarah took a deep breath, both grateful and anxious about what the officer might discover. Officer Jacob Stanton pulled up to Sarah's house, cutting his headlights as he parked. The street was quiet, with only the occasional buzz of crickets breaking the silence. He grabbed his flashlight and approached Sarah's front door with measured steps. Sarah opened the door before he could knock, her worried expression visible in the porch light. "Thank you for coming," she said, wringing her hands. "I know it might sound silly, but—" "Nothing silly about being cautious, ma'am," Officer Stanton assured her with a gentle smile. His calm demeanor seemed to help Sarah relax slightly. "Tell me everything you've noticed." Sarah described the shadow she'd seen the previous night and the recent noises. "Sounds like someone walking around in there," she explained, gesturing toward the abandoned house. "I can hear the floorboards creaking." Officer Stanton nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'll check it out thoroughly. Please stay inside and keep your doors locked until I give you the all-clear." Approaching the abandoned house, Officer Stanton swept his flashlight beam across the weathered exterior. The paint was peeling, and several windows were clouded with dust and grime. As he reached the front door, he noticed it wasn't fully closed. There was a small gap suggesting a recent entry. He pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the slight creak. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing empty rooms filled with cobwebs and scattered debris. Old furniture lay covered in dust, and footprints marked the dirty floor. Fresh ones, small in size. A sudden scuffling sound from upstairs caught his attention. Officer Stanton moved carefully up the creaking steps, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The noise came again, followed by what sounded like quick, light breathing. In one of the upstairs rooms, his flashlight beam fell on an overturned cabinet. Behind it, he caught a glimpse of movement, a small figure trying to make itself even smaller. "Hello?" Officer Stanton called out softly, lowering his flashlight to avoid frightening whoever was hiding. "I'm Officer Stanton. You don't need to be afraid." A boy's face peeked out briefly before ducking back behind the cabinet. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old. "It's okay," Officer Stanton said, keeping his voice gentle. He crouched down to appear less intimidating. "I'm here to help. Can you tell me your name?" The boy remained silent for a long moment. Then, in a trembling voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Malcolm." "Hi, Malcolm," Officer Stanton replied warmly. "Would you like to come out where I can see you better? I promise you're not in any trouble." Slowly, Malcolm emerged from his hiding place. His clothes were dirty, and he looked exhausted and frightened. Officer Stanton's heart ached at the sight. "How about we get you out of this dark house?" he suggested softly, extending his hand. "You're safe now, Malcolm. I promise." Officer Stanton guided Malcolm to the front steps of the abandoned house, the porch light from Sarah's home casting a gentle glow across the street. He noticed Sarah stepping onto her porch, concern etched on her face. "Ma'am, if you could give us a few minutes," he called out politely. "I need to speak with Malcolm alone." Sarah nodded understanding and stepped back, though she remained watching from her doorway. Officer Stanton sat down next to Malcolm, keeping enough distance to avoid making the boy feel crowded. The young boy's shoulders were hunched, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "Malcolm," Officer Stanton began gently, "can you tell me why you ran away? I want to help, but I need to understand what happened." Malcolm's eyes darted around nervously, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. He swallowed hard before speaking. It's Mr. Bolton," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He runs the orphanage." Officer Stanton remained silent, giving Malcolm time to continue at his own pace. The boy's hands trembled as he spoke. "He makes us work. All the black kids," Malcolm continued, his voice cracking. "We have to clean his house, work in his yard. If we say no—" He stopped, wrapping his arms around himself. "What happens if you say no, Malcolm?" Officer Stanton asked softly. Tears welled up in Malcolm's eyes. "He hits us, with his belt sometimes, or locks us in the basement with no food." The words tumbled out faster now, as if a dam had broken. Officer Stanton felt his jaw tighten, fighting to keep his expression neutral despite the anger building inside him. The thought of children being treated this way made his stomach turn. "I couldn't stay there anymore," Malcolm whispered. "Malcolm," Officer Stanton said, his voice firm but gentle, "I want you to know something very important. I believe you. Everything you've told me, I believe you. And I promise you, I'm going to look into this very carefully." Officer Stanton watched Malcolm carefully, noting how the boy's shoulders remained tense, his eyes distant as if lost in painful memories. The streetlight cast long shadows across the worn front porch steps where they sat, the evening air growing cooler with each passing minute. A moth fluttered nearby, drawn to the yellow glow above them. "Malcolm, is there anything else you want to tell me?" Officer Stanton asked softly, leaning forward slightly to show he was listening. "Anything at all?" Malcolm's fingers twisted anxiously in his lap as he stared at the ground, his worn sneakers scuffing against the concrete. Several long moments passed before he spoke, each second heavy with unspoken pain. There was my friend David," Malcolm whispered, his voice catching on the name like a snag in fabric. "He was like my brother. We shared a room at the orphanage. He had the bed by the window." Officer Stanton nodded encouragingly, keeping his expression gentle and open, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle the traumatized boy. "David and me, we helped each other through everything," Malcolm continued, his voice growing slightly stronger with the memories. "When Mr. Bolton would make us work all day cleaning or doing yard work, we'd tell each other stories at night. Adventure stories mostly, about brave knights and dragons. We promised we'd escape together someday." Tears welled up in Malcolm's eyes as he went on, his small hands clutching the fabric of his pants. "One night, maybe 2 weeks ago, Mr. Bolton called David to his office. I didn't think much about it then. We got called to his office sometimes for chores, but David never came back to our room." Malcolm's hands began to shake visibly in the dim light. "I asked him where David was, but he just said he got transferred to another orphanage. But that didn't make sense. David would have said goodbye to me. He would have told me if he was leaving. We promised to always tell each other everything." Officer Stanton noticed Malcolm's breathing becoming more rapid as he approached the hardest part of his story, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow bursts. "That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about David. So I snuck out of my room to look for him." Malcolm's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, the words seeming to scratch their way out of his throat. "I was hiding in the hallway near Mr. Bolton's office when I saw—" He stopped, his whole body trembling now like a leaf in the wind. "What did you see, Malcolm?" Officer Stanton prompted gently, fighting to keep his own voice steady. "Mr. Bolton," Malcolm choked out, his fingers digging into his knees. He was dragging someone, down the hall toward the basement. It was David, I know it was. I recognized his red t-shirt. He wasn't moving at all." Tears streamed down Malcolm's face now, catching the streetlight like tiny diamonds. "I don't know if he was just knocked out or... Malcolm couldn't continue, his words dissolving into quiet sobs that shook his small frame. The memory was clearly overwhelming him, dragging him back to that terrible night. Officer Stanton felt his own eyes growing wet as he watched the young boy break down, his heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and rage. The cruelty of what these children had endured was almost unbearable to hear. He placed a gentle, steadying hand on Malcolm's shoulder, feeling the tremors that ran through the boy's body. The night had grown considerably colder, and Officer Stanton noticed Malcolm shivering slightly in his thin t-shirt, the cotton fabric offering little protection against the biting autumn air. Looking at his watch, the glowing numbers showing well past 9, he realized they needed to figure out sleeping arrangements for the boy. "Malcolm," he said gently, keeping his voice soft and steady like he would with a frightened animal. "It's getting late. I think we should head to the police station where Child Protective Services can help find you a safe place to stay for the night." The change in Malcolm was immediate and dramatic. His body stiffened like a board, and his eyes widened with unmistakable fear, pupils dilating in the dim light. He shrank away from Officer Stanton, wrapping his arms tightly around himself as if trying to hold himself together. "No, please," Malcolm whispered, his voice trembling like autumn leaves in the wind. "Not the police station." "Why not?" Officer Stanton asked, though the sinking feeling in his stomach told him he already knew the answer, dreading what the boy might reveal. Malcolm's gaze dropped to the ground, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt, pulling at loose threads until they began to unravel. "The police. They came to the orphanage sometimes. They'd go into Mr. Bolton's office." He swallowed hard before continuing, his throat working visibly. "I saw them taking envelopes from him, fat envelopes full of money." Officer Stanton felt his jaw tighten as Malcolm went on, each word hitting him like a physical blow. "Once David had bruises all over his arms from where Mr. Bolton grabbed him. When the police came for their regular visit, David tried to show them." Malcolm's voice grew quieter, barely above a whisper now. "They just laughed and said he must have been playing too rough with the other kids. They always did that. Acted like we were making things up, like we were just stupid children." The boy's shoulders hunched forward as if trying to make himself smaller, disappearing into himself. "Sometimes when Mr. Bolton was really mad, he'd remind us that nobody would believe us anyway. He said the police were his friends, that they'd always take his side over ours." Officer Stanton felt sick to his stomach, bile rising in his throat. The corruption ran deeper than he'd imagined, spreading like poison through the very system meant to protect these children, and Malcolm's fear made perfect sense. The boy had learned the hard way that even those meant to protect him could be bought with dirty money and false promises. "I can't go there," Malcolm pleaded, his eyes filling with fresh tears that caught the streetlight like tiny diamonds. "They might send me back, or somewhere just as bad. Please don't make me go." Looking at the terrified child before him, Officer Stanton made his decision, his conscience clear despite the rules he'd have to bend. He leaned forward, meeting Malcolm's frightened gaze directly, willing the boy to see his sincerity. "Malcolm, listen to me," he said firmly but kindly, putting every ounce of conviction into his words. "I promise you won't ever have to go back to that place. Let's go back to my place. You will be safe there." The drive to Officer Stanton's house was quiet, with Malcolm staring out the window at the passing streetlights. When they pulled into the driveway of a modest 2-story home with warm yellow light spilling from its windows, Malcolm's hands tightened in his lap. Laura Stanton opened the door before they reached it, her kind face showing surprise at the unexpected guest. Her eyes softened when she saw Malcolm's small figure partially hidden behind her husband. "This is Malcolm," Officer Stanton explained quietly. "He'll be staying with us tonight." Sophie, their 8-year-old daughter, peeked around her mother's legs, her curious eyes bright with interest. "Hi," she chirped, waving enthusiastically. Malcolm managed a tiny nod in response, shrinking further behind Officer Stanton. Inside the warm house, Sophie's energy bubbled over as she tried to make their guest feel welcome. "Want to see my toys? I have lots of cool ones." She bounced on her toes, already heading toward the stairs. Malcolm glanced uncertainly at Officer Stanton, who gave him an encouraging nod. In Sophie's room, filled with colorful decorations and stuffed animals, Malcolm stood awkwardly while Sophie showed him her favorite teddy bear and a collection of toy cars. The stark difference between their lives was evident in every cheerful poster on the wall, every carefree laugh from Sophie's lips. Laura called them down for a late dinner, having quickly prepared a plate of chicken nuggets and mac and cheese. Malcolm's eyes widened at the sight of the food, and he ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid it might disappear. Sophie filled the silence with stories about her day at school, while Malcolm listened, stealing occasional glances at the family around him. Officer Stanton watched the scene unfold, his heart heavy with the contrast between his daughter's blessed life and Malcolm's struggles. Sophie's biggest worry that day had been whether she'd get to sit next to her best friend at lunch. Malcolm had been running from abuse and grieving a missing friend. Later, Laura led Malcolm to the guest room, carrying fresh blankets that smelled of lavender detergent. She made up the bed while Malcolm stood in the doorway, watching her methodical movements. "If you need anything during the night, anything at all," Laura said gently, "our room is just down the hall. Don't hesitate to wake us, okay?" Malcolm nodded, his eyes taking in the clean, comfortable room with a mix of wonder and uncertainty. Before heading to bed, Officer Stanton stopped by to check on him. Malcolm was already under the covers, looking small against the queen-sized bed. "I'll be right next door if you need me," Stanton assured him softly. "You're safe here, Malcolm. Try to get some rest." As Malcolm's eyes began to close, Officer Stanton made his way to his study, his determination to investigate the orphanage burning stronger than ever. In the quiet of his study, Officer Stanton settled into his worn leather chair and opened his laptop with determined focus. The clock on the wall showed 11:45 p.m., but sleep was far from his mind as the weight of recent revelations pressed heavily upon him. He logged into the police database, his fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing "Sunrise Orphanage" into the search field, his heart already heavy with anticipation. The initial results made his stomach turn and his throat tighten. Complaint after complaint filled his screen, dating back several years, each one a testament to systematic negligence. He clicked on the first file, a report from 2019 about children working late hours in what appeared to be a warehouse, their small hands forced to labor in the darkness. Status: dismissed. Insufficient evidence. The next file detailed allegations of physical abuse with photographs of angry purple bruises on a young boy's trembling arms. Status: unsubstantiated. Stanton's jaw clenched as he dug deeper, his police instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. He created a detailed spreadsheet to track the patterns emerging from the reports, color-coding suspicious entries. Names of missing children caught his attention like desperate cries from the past. Thomas Wright, age 12, transferred to another facility with no forwarding information. Maria Rodriguez, age 9, listed as a runaway with no follow-up investigation. And there, dated just 3 months ago, David Johnson, age 10, Malcolm's friend, marked as transferred, with no additional details, his fate a haunting question mark. The timestamps on the case dismissals raised glaring red flags, setting off every alarm in Stanton's experienced mind. Most complaints were closed within 24 hours of being filed, far too quickly for any proper investigation to take place. Several officers' names appeared repeatedly on these dismissals: Officers Peters, Martinez, and Collins. Stanton recognized them as senior officers with connections to City Hall and reputations for taking the easy way out. As he cross-referenced the data, more disturbing patterns emerged from the digital paper trail. Large deposits appeared in the orphanage's accounts shortly after each dismissed complaint, labeled as private donations in neat, suspicious rows. The amounts were substantial, far exceeding typical charitable contributions, often reaching into 6 figures. These deposits coincided perfectly with dates when children were reported missing or transferred, creating an undeniable pattern of corruption. Stanton opened another document, carefully noting connections between the complaints, the officers involved, and the money trail, his police training helping him piece together this dark puzzle. Mr. Bolton's name appeared consistently, but he wasn't acting alone in this web of exploitation. Several prominent business owners and city officials were listed as board members of the orphanage's governing body, their respected positions providing a shield of legitimacy. The evidence pointed to something far more sinister than individual acts of abuse. This was organized, systematic exploitation of vulnerable children, protected by those meant to prevent such crimes. A network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of local authority. Stanton's hands shook slightly as he compiled his findings into a comprehensive report, including dates, names, and transaction records, each entry another nail in the coffin of this conspiracy. The next morning, Officer Stanton walked into the police station with a thick manila folder tucked under his arm. Dark circles shadowed his eyes from the sleepless night. but determination fueled his steps as he made his way to Captain McCall's office. The familiar buzz of phones and chatter filled the precinct, but something felt different today. Heavier, more ominous. He knocked on the captain's door, hearing a gruff "come in" from the other side. Captain McCall sat behind his desk, his silver hair neatly combed, his uniform pristine. The captain's steel-gray eyes followed Stanton as he approached the desk. "Sir, I need to discuss something urgent with you," Stanton began, pulling out his carefully compiled evidence. "It's about Sunrise Orphanage and Raymond Bolton." McCall's expression remained neutral as Stanton spread the documents across his desk. "I've uncovered a pattern of abuse and missing children. There are dozens of dismissed complaints, suspicious financial transactions, and children who've simply vanished without proper investigation." Stanton pointed to specific cases, his voice growing more passionate. "This boy, David Johnson, disappeared 3 months ago. Another child witnessed Bolton dragging what appeared to be his unconscious body through the hallway. And look at these deposits. Large sums of money coming in right after complaints are dismissed." McCall picked up one of the papers, his face unreadable. After a moment, he set it down and leaned back in his chair. "Officer Stanton," he said, his voice cold and dismissive, "these are nothing but unsubstantiated allegations and coincidences. Where's your concrete evidence?" "Sir, the pattern is clear," Stanton started, but McCall cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Drop it, Stanton. This won't lead anywhere good." McCall's eyes hardened. "Focus on your regular cases. We have real crimes that need attention." Something in McCall's tone made Stanton's skin crawl. The captain wasn't just dismissing the evidence, he was warning him off. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. McCall knew something. He was part of this. Gathering his papers with steady hands despite his racing heart, Stanton left the office. The weight of corruption felt suffocating now, knowing it reached right into his own precinct, to his own captain. When he arrived home, Malcolm was waiting in the living room, fidgeting with the hem of his borrowed t-shirt. Stanton sat down beside him, his voice gentle but serious. "Malcolm, I need to ask you something important," he said. "If you saw the man who was dragging David that night, would you be able to identify him?" Malcolm's eyes met Stanton's, fear mixing with determination. "Yes," he replied without hesitation, his small hands clenching into fists. "I want to help. I want to make sure Mr. Bolton can't hurt anyone else." Later that evening, he decided to visit the orphanage and get some pictures so that Malcolm could identify them later. Officer Stanton settled into a corner table at the Maple Street coffee shop, positioning himself with a clear view of Sunrise Orphanage across the street. He ordered a black coffee and opened his laptop, appearing to work while his camera rested inconspicuously on the table beside him. Through the cafe's large windows, he observed the orphanage's entrance. The building looked deceivingly pleasant from the outside, with its red brick facade and neat flower beds. But knowing what happened behind those walls made his stomach turn. Staff members occasionally passed through the front doors, a cleaning lady with her cart, a cook carrying groceries, and various administrative workers clutching folders. Stanton photographed each one discreetly, though none matched Malcolm's description of Bolton. After about an hour, raised voices drew his attention. A tall man burst through the front doors, his face red with anger as he berated a young staff member trailing behind him. The man's presence commanded attention. Broad-shouldered and well-dressed in an expensive suit, but with cold eyes that seemed to pierce through anyone who dared look his way. Stanton's fingers moved swiftly over his camera, capturing several clear shots of the man's face from different angles. The way the staff member cowered, how other workers quickly scattered at his approach. This had to be Bolton. Later on, Stanton sat with Malcolm at the kitchen table, spreading out the printed photos. Sophie played nearby with her dolls while Laura prepared dinner, the smell of pot roast filling the house. "Do you recognize anyone in these pictures, Malcolm?" Stanton asked gently. Malcolm's hands trembled slightly as he looked through the photos. When he reached the images of the angry man, he froze. His breath caught, and he pushed the photo away quickly. "That's him," Malcolm whispered, his voice shaking. "That's Mr. Bolton." Stanton placed a reassuring hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "You're doing great, Malcolm. Can you tell me anything else about him? About the orphanage? Malcolm glanced around nervously before leaning closer. There's something else you need to know, he said quietly. Mr. Bolton has a secret basement in his house. It's connected to the orphanage through a tunnel. When inspectors come, he makes us, the black kids, hide down there so nobody sees how many of us there really are. Do you know where this basement is? Stanton asked, pulling out his notebook. Malcolm nodded. The entrance is behind his office bookshelf. I saw him open it once when he thought no one was watching, and I heard other kids talk about being taken there. Stanton carefully wrote down every detail Malcolm shared. When they finished, he looked at the boy with pride and gratitude. Thank you for being so brave, Malcolm. We're getting closer to stopping him. Malcolm managed a small smile, visibly relieved to have shared this information. He looked over at Sophie, who was now offering him one of her dolls to play with. Laura called them all to dinner, and Malcolm's shoulders relaxed as he joined the family at the table, finding comfort in their protective presence. Officer Stanton pulled up to Sunrise Orphanage the next morning, his police cruiser coming to a stop in the cracked parking lot. Through his windshield, he noticed several children playing near the entrance. When they spotted his car, they scattered like startled birds, their faces tight with fear. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, he stepped out of his vehicle. The orphanage loomed before him, its window staring down like hollow eyes. Near a rusty swing set, two young boys watched him intently, their small hands gripping each other's sleeves. Inside, the air felt heavy with the smell of bleach and old carpet. Mr. Bolton appeared almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting. His broad frame filled the narrow hallway as he approached with an artificial smile. Officer Stanton, what a pleasant surprise, Bolton said, reading his name badge. His grip was uncomfortably firm. To what do we owe this visit? Routine check, Mr. Bolton, Stanton replied coolly. I'd like to inspect the facilities. Of course. Bolton's smile never reached his eyes. Though I must say, we usually receive notice before inspections. As they walked through the common areas, Stanton noticed children everywhere going silent at their approach. In the dining hall, a young girl dropped her eyes to the floor when Bolton passed. In a classroom, students hunched lower over their desks, their shoulders tense. The children seem quiet, Stanton observed. We maintain strict discipline here, Bolton replied smoothly. Structure is important for troubled youth. Stanton paused near Bolton's office. I'd like to see the basement facilities. Bolton's smile tightened. Basement? I'm afraid you're mistaken. We have no basement here. Several sources suggest otherwise. Your sources are wrong, Bolton said flatly. And without a warrant, Officer Stanton, I'm afraid you have no authority to search our premises. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have important matters to attend to. The fake warmth had vanished from Bolton's voice. He stood straighter, his expression hard and challenging. Of course, Stanton said, matching Bolton's tone. I'll be back, Mr. Bolton, with that warrant. Good day, officer, Bolton replied, his words dripping with condescension. Don't return without proper documentation. Stanton walked back through the silent hallways, feeling Bolton's eyes on his back. The children he passed seemed to shrink into the shadows, their faces a mixture of hope and resignation. Outside, he climbed into his cruiser, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Bolton was prepared, possibly protected. This would take more than a surprise visit to crack. Jacob Stanton then drove home, their amber glow creating pools of light that seemed to float in the darkness. His mind kept circling back to the orphanage visit, to Bolton's smug face, and those frightened children who'd huddled away from adult contact. The steering wheel felt cool under his grip as he navigated the familiar curves, searching for a way forward that wouldn't lead to another dead end, another path blocked by corruption and fear. A flash of headlights in his rearview mirror caught his attention, bright and aggressive in the darkness. The car behind him was approaching fast, too fast, its engine roaring like an angry beast. Before he could react, the vehicle swerved violently toward him. No. Jacob's heart jumped into his throat as he yanked the wheel, barely avoiding the impact. The attacking car veered closer, metal nearly scraping metal, forcing Jacob onto the shoulder of the road with deadly intent. Gravel crunched under his tires as he fought to maintain control, bits of stone pinging against his undercarriage. His police training kicked in, years of experience helping him keep the car steady despite his racing pulse and the surge of adrenaline. The mysterious vehicle roared past him and disappeared into the darkness ahead, leaving Jacob breathing hard on the roadside, his knuckles white on the wheel. After taking a moment to collect himself, letting his heartbeat settle back to normal, he carefully pulled back onto the pavement. His hands were shaking slightly as he completed the drive home, every set of approaching headlights making him tense. The house lights were on when he arrived, warm and welcoming against the night sky. Inside, he found Laura reading on the couch while Sophie and Malcolm played a board game on the floor, their faces lit with simple joy. The sight of them, safe and peaceful, made his stomach twist as he realized how close he'd come to disaster, how easily this evening could have ended differently. He was double-checking the door locks, testing each one twice when his phone rang. Captain McCall's name flashed on the screen, bright and demanding. "Stanton," he answered, keeping his voice steady despite the lingering tension in his shoulders. "I heard about your visit to Sunrise today," McCall said, his tone icy enough to freeze the air. "You're making waves where you shouldn't." "Sir, Listen carefully," McCall cut him off, his words sharp as broken glass. "Bolton has friends in high places, the kind who can make life very difficult for officers who don't mind their own business. Think about your family, Stanton." Jacob's jaw clenched as he watched Laura helping the children clean up their game, their innocent laughter a stark contrast to the menace in McCall's voice. "Are you threatening me, Captain?" "I'm giving you good advice," McCall replied coldly, each word measured and deliberate. "Reconsider your investigation, for everyone's sake." The line went dead, leaving Jacob standing in his darkened hallway, the phone still pressed to his ear like a dead weight. His superior's warning echoed in his mind, mixing with memories of those frightened children at the orphanage, and Malcolm's haunted eyes when he spoke of his friend David, who had vanished without a trace. After a moment's hesitation, his hand slightly trembling, he pulled out his phone and scrolled to a familiar name, Marcus Hale, his former mentor, and the one person he knew he could trust completely. The phone rang twice before Marcus's warm, gravelly voice answered, bringing back memories of late-night stakeouts and shared coffee. "Jacob, it's been a while." "Sir, I need your help," Jacob said, keeping his voice low and glancing at his darkened windows. "I've stumbled onto something big. Corruption, child abuse, possibly worse. I can't discuss details over the phone, but could you come by tonight?" There was a brief pause before Marcus responded, his tone carrying the weight of understanding. "I'll be there in an hour." True to his word, Marcus's car pulled into the driveway as the sun was setting, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. Jacob led his former mentor to his study, closing the door behind them with a soft click. Marcus settled into a worn leather chair, his experienced eyes taking in Jacob's troubled expression and the tension in his shoulders. "Tell me everything," Marcus said quietly, leaning forward with the same focused attention that had made him such an effective detective. Jacob began sharing the story, starting with finding Malcolm and leading up to the threatening phone call from Captain McCall. His words tumbled out faster as he described the fearful children at the orphanage, Bolton's smugness, and the attempted runoff on the road. His voice grew tight as he mentioned the missing children and the suspicious dismissal of previous complaints, his fists clenching at the memory. "The whole system's protecting him, Marcus," Jacob said, running a hand through his hair, his frustration evident in every movement. "Every time I try to push forward, I hit another wall, and now they're threatening my family." Marcus leaned forward, his weathered face etched with concern and determination, the lamplight deepening the lines around his eyes. "This goes deeper than just Bolton, doesn't it?" "Much deeper. I'm worried about what they might do to Laura and Sophie, and Malcolm. But I can't just walk away knowing what's happening to those kids." Jacob's voice cracked slightly on the last words. Marcus stood up, placing a firm hand on Jacob's shoulder, the gesture carrying years of shared trust and understanding. "You're not alone in this anymore, son. We'll find a way to bring Bolton down, the right way, with evidence they can't ignore or bury." Jacob felt some of the tension leave his body, grateful for his mentor's unwavering support. The familiar scent of Marcus's aftershave brought back memories of countless cases they'd solved together. "Thank you, Marcus. I wasn't sure who else I could trust." Marcus nodded, his eyes sharp with determination as he began pacing the small room. "Let me lay out what I think we should do. I've got an idea that might just work. We need to use Malcolm," Marcus said carefully, watching Jacob's reaction. "But only if he's willing. We can't force this on him. The boy's been through enough trauma already." Jacob shifted uncomfortably in his chair, concern etched on his face. His fingers drummed nervously against the armrest. "Using him as bait? Marcus, after everything he's been through, I don't know if I can put him at risk like that." "I know," Marcus nodded, understanding Jacob's hesitation. His eyes softened with sympathy. "But it might be our only shot at getting inside that basement. Bolton's too careful otherwise. He's got eyes everywhere, except when he's distracted." Taking a long sip of coffee, Marcus outlined the details, his voice steady and measured. Malcolm would approach the front gate, make sure Bolton spots him. The moment Bolton comes out to grab him, I'll be waiting in my car nearby. I'll get Malcolm to safety while you slip in through the back. We'll have a second car ready, just in case. Jacob rubbed his temples, considering the risks. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders. The basement might be locked, and if Bolton catches me inside, we both know what he's capable of. "We'll bring tools," Marcus assured him, reaching into his jacket to pull out a small leather case. "Small ones you can hide easily. You'll need to move fast. Get photos of whatever you find down there. Every piece of evidence counts." They discussed the timing, agreeing that morning would be best, when the children would likely still be hidden away. The street would be quieter then, fewer witnesses to complicate things. Jacob pulled out a notepad, sketching a rough layout of the orphanage based on what Malcolm had described, his pen moving quickly across the paper. "Here's where the basement entrance should be," Jacob pointed to the drawing, tapping the spot with his pen. Malcolm said it's behind a false wall in Bolton's office. Marcus studied the sketch intently, his years of detective work evident in his careful analysis. "We'll need to time this perfectly. Once Bolton spots Malcolm, you'll have maybe 10 minutes at most. Every second will count." "That's assuming everything goes according to plan," Jacob added, worry lines creasing his forehead. His coffee sat untouched, growing cold beside him. "It's risky," Marcus admitted, leaning back in his chair with a heavy sigh. "But those kids need help now. We can't wait any longer. Every day we delay is another day they suffer." Jacob nodded, knowing his old mentor was right. They spent the next hour going over every detail, planning for various scenarios and potential complications. The coffee grew cold in their cups as they focused on perfecting their strategy, the clock on the wall ticking steadily in the background. "Thank you, Marcus," Jacob said finally, his voice thick with gratitude. "I couldn't do this alone. I mean it." Marcus squeezed Jacob's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "Get some rest. We'll talk to Malcolm in the morning, see if he's willing to help. But only if he feels ready. The boy's safety comes first. Always." The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Jacob and Marcus sat with Malcolm at the breakfast table. Laura had made pancakes, but Malcolm had barely touched his food, his attention focused on the two men explaining their plan. "We want you to know that you don't have to do this," Jacob said gently, his voice warm and reassuring. "Your safety comes first. If you're not comfortable with any part of this plan, just say the word." Malcolm's small hands gripped the edge of the table as he listened. Though fear flickered in his eyes, there was also a determined set to his jaw. Marcus leaned forward, his grandfatherly presence bringing comfort to the tense atmosphere. "I'll be right there in the car," Marcus explained, pointing to a simple diagram they'd drawn. "The moment Bolton comes out, you run straight to me. I won't let anything happen to you." Malcolm nodded slowly, absorbing every detail. "What about the other kids?" he asked quietly. "The ones in the basement?" "That's where I'll be," Jacob answered. "While Bolton's distracted by seeing you, I'll slip inside and get evidence of everything he's doing. We'll make sure he can't hurt any more children." Malcolm took a deep breath, his shoulders straightening. "I want to help," he said firmly. "I know where he keeps them. They need someone to save them." By mid-morning, their plan was in motion. Marcus drove his weathered sedan with Malcolm in the passenger seat, parking carefully on a quiet street near the orphanage. The building loomed ahead, its windows like dark eyes watching their approach. Jacob had borrowed Laura's blue Honda, knowing Bolton would recognize his own car. He parked on the opposite end of the street, keeping the orphanage in view while staying hidden behind a newspaper. His phone sat ready in his lap, waiting for Marcus's signal. "Remember," Marcus said to Malcolm, giving the boy's shoulder a gentle squeeze, "you just need to let him see you. I'll be right here. You won't be alone for a second." Malcolm's hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. "I'm ready." Marcus pulled out his phone, sending a quick text to Jacob. "In position." Jacob's response came immediately. "Ready when you are." Malcolm unbuckled his seatbelt, his small frame tense but determined. Marcus gave him an encouraging nod, his kind eyes full of admiration for the boy's courage. Taking one final deep breath, Malcolm opened the car door and stepped out into the morning light, facing the iron gates of the place that had caused him so much pain. Malcolm's heart pounded like a drum against his ribs as he approached the iron gates of Sunrise Orphanage. It didn't take long at all. Through the grimy, dusty windows, Malcolm saw Bolton's large figure pause mid-stride, then do an exaggerated double-take that would have been comical under different circumstances. The warden's face twisted with an ugly rage as he recognized the boy who had dared to escape his clutches, his features contorting into something barely human. "You!" Bolton's voice boomed across the yard like thunder as he burst through the front door, making the hinges rattle. "Get back here right now, you little troublemaker. You'll regret ever running away." Malcolm felt his legs go weak with terror as Bolton stormed toward him, his heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel, but he remembered Jacob's careful instructions from their planning session. After a moment of seemingly frozen fear, letting Bolton get closer, he turned and ran, hearing the warden's thundering footsteps and labored breathing behind him. As soon as Bolton cleared the entrance, Jacob emerged from Laura's car like a shadow. Moving swiftly but silently across the yard, he slipped through the orphanage's front door, his footsteps barely making a whisper on the worn floorboards. The corridors were eerily quiet, most of the children likely confined to their rooms as punishment or through fear. Following Malcolm's detailed directions memorized during their planning, Jacob navigated the maze-like hallways until he reached the basement entrance. A heavy metal door stood at the end of a dimly lit corridor, secured with multiple rusty locks. Jacob pulled out the crowbar he'd brought, his hand steady despite the urgency of the situation and the weight of what he might find. The locks gave way with several forceful strikes, the metal groaning in protest. Jacob pulled the door open, wincing at its slight creak that seemed to echo in the silence. The sight that greeted him made his stomach turn and his throat tighten. In the dank basement, illuminated only by a single bare bulb, several black children sat huddled together on dirty mattresses, their hands bound with rope and mouths gagged with dirty cloth. Their eyes widened with fear as they saw him, some shrinking back into the shadows while others looked up with desperate hope in their tear-stained faces. Jacob quickly pulled out his phone with trembling fingers, documenting everything he saw. He photographed the cruel bindings, the cramped conditions, the moldy walls, and the clearly traumatized children. His hands shook with barely contained anger, but he forced himself to focus, knowing these images would be crucial evidence to finally bring Bolton to justice. "It's okay," he whispered to the children, keeping his voice gentle and calm despite the rage burning in his chest. "I'm here to help. You're going to be safe now. No one will hurt you anymore." Jacob's hands moved swiftly from child to child, gently removing gags and untying bonds with practiced efficiency. The basement's dim light cast long, menacing shadows across 17 young faces, each marked with fear and uncertainty that no child should ever have to experience. His stomach churned violently at the sight of angry rope burns on small wrists and tear-stained cheeks, some still wet with fresh anguish. "It's all right now," he whispered, his voice steady despite the righteous anger burning like hot coals in his chest. "I'm a police officer. You're safe." He worked methodically, checking each child for injuries while offering quiet words of comfort and gentle touches of reassurance. Some of the younger ones trembled uncontrollably, their small bodies shaking with residual fear, while others watched him with cautious hope beginning to dawn in their eyes. The sudden sound of heavy footsteps above made Jacob freeze mid-motion. The children tensed as one, their eyes widening in terror at the familiar sound. The footsteps grew louder and more deliberate, approaching the basement door with measured steps. Jacob smoothly positioned himself between the children and the entrance, drawing his service weapon with fluid precision, just as Bolton's massive frame filled the doorway, blocking the dim light from above. Bolton's face contorted with unbridled rage when he saw Jacob standing among the freed children. "What do you think you're doing?" he snarled, taking a threatening step forward into the basement. "Don't move," Jacob commanded, his gun trained steadily on Bolton's chest. "You're under arrest." He pulled out his phone with his free hand, never letting his aim waver. "I have photos of everything, the basement, the children, the restraints, every bit of evidence. It's over, Bolton." "You fool," Bolton sneered, though uncertainty flickered in his cold eyes. "Do you have any idea who I know? Who protects me? One call and—" "Save it," Jacob cut him off firmly. "Your friends can't help you now, not with this. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." When Bolton hesitated, Jacob's voice hardened to steel. "Now." Bolton's broad shoulders slumped as the reality of his situation finally sank in. He turned slowly, his movements stiff with barely contained fury, allowing Jacob to approach with handcuffs. The metal clicked around Bolton's wrists with a satisfying finality, the sound echoing off the concrete walls of the basement. "You're going to regret this," Bolton spat venomously as Jacob secured the cuffs with an extra tug. Jacob ignored the empty threat, reaching for his radio with steady fingers. "This is Officer Stanton. I need immediate backup at Sunrise Orphanage. I have 17 children in need of medical attention and one suspect in custody." He kept his gun trained on Bolton while maintaining reassuring eye contact with the children. "Help is coming," he assured them softly. "You're all going to be okay." The children huddled together like frightened birds, watching with wide eyes as their tormentor stood handcuffed and defeated before them. Some began to cry softly, but these were tears of relief rather than fear, the first taste of freedom washing over them. Jacob could hear multiple sirens in the distance, growing closer with each passing second, their wailing promise of safety drawing nearer. Next, Jacob's fingers moved swiftly across his phone's keypad as he made a few more urgent calls. The first went to Child Protective Services, where he spoke with determination and clarity about the 17 children who needed immediate assistance. The social worker on the other end assured him they would dispatch a team right away. His next call went to Ben Harper, a journalist known throughout the city for his unwavering commitment to exposing corruption. "Ben, it's Officer Stanton. I've got something big you need to see. Sunrise Orphanage. We just rescued 17 children from deplorable conditions. Within 30 minutes, the orphanage grounds filled with CPS vehicles and social workers. They moved with practiced efficiency, wrapping blankets around shivering shoulders and offering gentle words of comfort." Jacob watched as they distributed water bottles and snacks, his heart lifting as he saw the first tentative smiles appear on some of the children's faces. Ben Harper arrived shortly after, his weathered notepad already in hand. His eyes widened as Jacob led him through the basement, showing him the ropes and gags that had bound the children. "This is worse than anything I've seen," Harper muttered, scribbling furiously. "How long has this been going on?" Jacob shared everything: the pattern of abuse, the missing children reports, the police department's willful ignorance. He handed over copies of his photographic evidence, watching as Harper's expression grew increasingly grim. "This story needs to break wide open," Harper declared, his jaw set with determination. "Not just Bolton, the whole system that let this happen. I'll make sure every detail comes to light." As the CPS workers began organizing the children for transport to emergency housing, Jacob pulled Marcus aside. "Can you take Malcolm back to my place?" he asked. "I need to finish up here, but I don't want him alone." Marcus nodded, his expression soft with understanding. "Of course. He'll be safe with me. Jacob approached Malcolm, who stood watching the scene with mixed emotions playing across his young face. I'll be home as soon as I can, Jacob assured him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. You're safe now, Malcolm. Bolton can't hurt anyone anymore. Malcolm nodded, managing a small smile before following Marcus to his car. Jacob watched them drive away, then turned back to supervise the final stages of the rescue operation. CPS workers carefully loaded the children into vans, each child clutching a small bag of essential items hastily gathered from their rooms. The weight that had pressed on Jacob's chest for days began to lift as he watched the last van pull away from the orphanage. The children were finally safe, headed toward proper care and protection. Bolton's reign of terror had ended, and justice would soon follow. Jacob's car pulled into his driveway that evening. Inside, Marcus, Laura, and Malcolm sat at the kitchen table, sharing a plate of cookies that Laura had baked. Malcolm's face lit up when he saw Jacob, but there was worry in his eyes too. Hey, buddy, Jacob said softly, settling into a chair beside Malcolm. The weight of what he needed to say pressed heavily on his chest. Marcus gave him an encouraging nod. Malcolm, Jacob began, his voice gentle but firm. We need to talk about what happens next. The people at Child Protective Services have found a really nice place for you and the other children from the orphanage to stay. Malcolm's shoulders tensed and his lower lip trembled. But I thought maybe I could stay here with you and Laura and Sophie. Jacob's heart ached at the boy's words. The new place is really good, Malcolm. You'll get proper schooling, good food, and caring people looking after you. It's nothing like the orphanage. I promise you that. Tears welled up in Malcolm's dark eyes. You saved me, he whispered, his voice catching. I don't want to leave. You're like family now. Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. It showed him, Laura, and Sophie at the park last summer, all smiling brightly. I want you to have this, he said, placing it in Malcolm's trembling hands. Whenever you feel alone or scared, just look at it and remember that we're thinking of you. We will visit as often as I can, and you can call me anytime. Malcolm clutched the photo to his chest, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. Promise? I promise, Jacob replied firmly. You're part of our family now, Malcolm. That doesn't change just because you're living somewhere else. Marcus stood up, placing a gentle hand on Malcolm's shoulder. Ready to go, son? Officer Stanton and I will take you there together. Malcolm nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. They walked out to Jacob's car, where Laura and Sophie came to say goodbye with tight hugs and promises to bake his favorite cookies when he visited. The drive to the CPS office was quiet, broken only by Malcolm's occasional sniffles. When they arrived, a kind-faced social worker greeted them at the entrance. Jacob knelt down to Malcolm's level one last time. You're one of the bravest people I've ever met, he told the boy. Never forget that. Malcolm threw his arms around Jacob's neck, holding on tight for a moment before stepping back. The social worker gently took his hand, and Malcolm managed a small wave as they walked toward the building's entrance. Jacob and Marcus stood watching until Malcolm disappeared inside. The boy clutched the family photo in his free hand, a reminder that he wasn't alone anymore. Months passed by and things slowly improved. The autumn sun cast a warm glow on the new residential facility as Jacob stood before it, taking in the sight. The building had undergone a complete transformation. Fresh paint, colorful murals, and well-maintained gardens replaced the grim facade of the former orphanage. Children's laughter drifted through open windows, a sound that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Inside, the halls buzzed with activity. Children darted past carrying books and art supplies. Some faces he recognized from that day in Bolton's basement, faces that now shone with health and happiness instead of fear. A young girl who had been among the rescued children waved shyly as she passed. Officer Stanton, called out Ms. Reynolds, one of the staff members. Malcolm's just finishing up his math class. Would you like to wait in the recreation room? Before Jacob could answer, he heard rapid footsteps. Malcolm burst into view, his face lighting up with recognition. Jacob! He cried out, running forward to wrap his arms around Jacob's waist. Jacob noticed the changes immediately. Malcolm's frame had filled out. His clothes were new and well-fitting, and his eyes sparkled with life. Gone was the frightened boy from the abandoned house. In his place stood a child full of energy and hope. "Look at you," Jacob said warmly, ruffling Malcolm's hair. "How's school going?" Malcolm eagerly shared stories about his classes, his new friends, and the art therapy sessions he particularly enjoyed. He pulled Jacob by the hand, showing him around the facility, his favorite reading corner, the garden where he helped grow vegetables, and the wall displaying children's artwork. "And see this?" Malcolm pointed to a drawing he'd made. "It's us when you found me in that old house. Ms. Reynolds says it's good to draw about hard times to help us feel better." They walked through the sunny courtyard, where other children played basketball and tended to flower beds. Malcolm's voice grew serious. "They found David's family," he said quietly. "They're helping the police find other kids like us who got hurt." Jacob nodded, knowing that Bolton's arrest had led to the exposure of a larger trafficking network. But today wasn't about that darkness. It was about celebrating how far Malcolm had come. "I still have the picture you gave me," Malcolm said, reaching into his pocket to show the now well-worn photograph of Jacob's family. "I look at it sometimes before bed, but I don't feel scared anymore." Jacob squeezed Malcolm's shoulder gently. "Remember, you can call me anytime. Laura and Sophie ask about you all the time." Malcolm beamed. "I know. And guess what? I'm getting all A's in science. Maybe I can be a police officer like you someday." If you enjoyed the story of Owen, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.